Good morning, everyone. If you could all please take your seats so we can start the session. Thank you very much. So just a few housekeeping tips. All right, so first on the WhatsApp group, Judith has announced that Alistair Nelson has withdrawn his talk. That was going to be at 9:35. Then for the speakers for this session, or both sessions, if you want to be mic'd up, please come to the sound desk before to get mic'd up, or you can use the speaker on stage, the mic on stage. Then for the African delegates, there was a WhatsApp that went out on the group yesterday. We would like to have a group photo of just the African delegates around tea time, so if you can please just get together and then we'll do that at that time. All right, so Hayley Clements is our first speaker this morning, and she will start the session with a... Okay, that's fine. All right, so Hayley Clements will start this session on a very highly debated trophy hunting and its socioeconomic and ecological impacts on sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks, Hayley.
Good morning, everybody. Very pleasantly surprised to see how many of you are in the room and not in game drive, so thanks for that. So yes, it is a controversial topic, and before I get into the insights we've found, I thought it might be useful, since this is a session on the wildlife economy, to just set the scene a bit more broadly first. So importantly, the wildlife economy, it aims to generate value out of wildlife with the objective of achieving both conservation and sustainable use objectives. Whether or not it always does that, of course, is up for debate, but that is really the objective of the wildlife economy, is these kind of two pillars of people and nature. And in an African context, there's at the moment these 5 pillars of the wildlife economy, those that we're more aware of: ecotourism and hunting. There's also wildlife ranching, which predominantly happens in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. And then there's also the use of other wild plants and animals. And then finally, there's the carbon markets, and I guess we could probably put biodiversity credits in that space as well. But for a lot of particularly Southern African countries, really the main pillars of the wildlife economy are ecotourism and hunting. And as we all know, one of those pillars is probably one of the most controversial topics in conservation today. There's an enormous global backlash, outcry about the practice, and the arguments from the anti-hunting campaigns are usually situated either in the ethical domain. It's not right for particularly international paying tourists to hunt animals for pleasure, but they also sit in criticizing that trophy hunting is detrimental to wildlife, and also that it is exploitative of local people. So the other campaign, or the other argument, is the opposite, essentially. So this was a response by, I think, 20 community leaders across multiple African countries to some recent campaigns by celebrities to ban trophy hunting. And they basically say here that these campaigns that you're associated with dismiss the beneficial impacts of regulated trophy hunting on local communities and our wildlife populations as myths. And so what this research wanted to do is really to interrogate, well, are these myths, or how much information do we have to support the fact that these aren't myths? And the trouble is, when you really go to look, there hasn't been a synthesis of this information. So it's this really debated topic, but actually the evidence is quite spread out and not well synthesized. And so we wanted to address that knowledge gap by reviewing. We went through close on 1,000 papers distilled to these 84 that actually test the impacts of trophy hunting on people or nature across 15 countries. So this just shows you where those papers come out of, and largely out of 4 countries: Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Tanzania, and to a lesser extent Zambia and Botswana. And this is unsurprising in that these are the countries that have the biggest trophy hunting industries. And if we hone in further on what are the commonly studied sites, it's also quite interesting because this starts to allude to the tenure that underlies trophy hunting. So some of the most commonly studied are the conservancies in Namibia, which the most studied are actually the communal conservancies where hunting takes place, and also private conservancies. In South Africa, hunting mostly takes place on private ranches. Compared to some of the other countries where hunting takes place, it's usually on game management areas or safari areas that surround national parks. And so those are state-owned, but communities are also expected to benefit. If we look at the number of studies over time, a focus on the impacts of hunting on nature still dominate, but encouragingly we're seeing an increasing focus on how trophy hunting impacts on people, and also a growing interdisciplinary focus, so papers that look at both impacts on people and nature. Zooming in then on what we actually found, so looking first at the impacts on nature, what you can see here is that there's 2 kind of broad categories. The one is focus on the hunted species, again testing the myth, or maybe not myth, that hunting is detrimental to species that are hunted. And these studies focus predominantly on abundance, as well as species demographics and behavior. But then looking more broadly, also studies that test this assumption that trophy hunting unlocks more land area for conservation by incentivizing conservation in those areas, and also that it improves the integrity of those ecosystems by, for example, reducing poaching, etc. We have much less evidence on the latter, and I think that this is an area that we really need a lot more research, particularly research that also has a counterfactual, like did trophy hunting actually unlock more land for conservation, and did it promote that good management in those areas? But if we hone in on, well, firstly in terms of what we have already on that, it's largely in support of trophy hunting as unlocking additional land and well-managed land for conservation. It's more mixed when it comes to the species. I think when it comes to species abundance, the evidence is more positive than negative, that it either actually enhanced populations of those species or at least didn't affect them. But when it comes to demographics and behavior, it's much more mixed. So demographics, often trophy hunting skews populations towards females, and species behavior, it affects how species utilize the landscape because of the threat of hunting. It's also nice to see that obviously the big and hairies, the most charismatic species, which are also the ones that bring in the most money for trophy hunting, they're the most studied, but we actually see quite a good distribution of species focused, of papers focused on a broader range of species. And then when it comes to the impacts of hunting on people, these are varying aspects of human well-being that we coded papers for, and you can see we don't understand too much about how it affects culture, governance, and social dimensions of human well-being. We have quite a lot more evidence of how it impacts the more economic aspects of human well-being, and health there is mostly around food security, so the idea that it usually provides meat to local communities, but in some cases it can create additional conflict and crop damage. So hence there's some positive and negative there, but by and large positive. When it comes to what we know the most about, that's how much money it makes. And there's an abundance of studies that quantify, well, how much revenues are generated from hunting, and the idea that that revenue wasn't there before, and so it's good. So by and large, those studies are saying hunting is good. But what I think is probably one of the most interesting findings is that in terms of the equity of that distribution, it's by and large perceived to be inequitable. So not necessarily worse than what was there before. Often those studies don't compare it to something from before, which makes it difficult to really unpack these trends. But it's important to at least people's perceptions are really important here. So local people that said, yes, it's brought in money, it's created jobs, but it's not fair in terms of how much money local communities are getting versus how much money hunting operators that come in and actually bring the clients and run their enterprises are getting, and how much money the government is getting. I also wondered if there was a correlation between hunting that's good for people and hunting that's good for nature. We don't have a lot of interdisciplinary studies, but in general, it seems that hunting that's good for people is good for nature, and hunting that's bad for people is bad for nature, and vice versa. And so the next stage of this research is really to try and unpack, well, it's not black and white, this issue, obviously. So why is it that we see good impacts in some places and contexts and bad impacts in other places and contexts? And to try and unpack the mechanisms behind the fact that it makes sense that if it's good for people and nature versus bad for people and nature. So today I thought I'd just give you two examples of case studies that try to unpack these mechanisms a bit. And this was a really nice paper that came out of the Midlands in Zimbabwe a couple of decades ago. So the Midlands is that central area in Zimbabwe. It's predominantly cattle ranching country. And what happened in Zimbabwe is that in 1975 they changed the legislation to enable private landowners, but also communities, to utilize the wildlife on their land. And what happened when they did this is that farmers started to allocate their land to wildlife. And we see this increase in the populations of particularly hunted species on those properties. So there was an incentive for landowners to protect the wildlife on their properties. Wildlife-related income increased fourfold over a period of about a decade. And then what emerged, and this is a nice study because it's a really good comparative study of cattle farming versus mixed, having wildlife and cattle versus having wildlife, is that they found that returns on investment were actually greater for wildlife than for cattle in this area, predominantly because of trophy hunting. And so because it was actually a viable land use, it incentivized landowners to transition over to wildlife and therefore allocate more land to wildlife, grow the populations, etc. So this, I think, is a nice example of this good for people, good for nature idea. The next and final case study I'll show is out of Uganda, where trophy hunting was introduced in two areas around Lake Mbaru National Park and also in a community wildlife area. And it was specifically introduced by the government to try and curb poaching in the area around this national park and in this community area. And so they enabled trophy hunting to occur. Outfitters came in to bring clients, generate revenues, and they agreed on a distribution of revenue between the local communities, these hunting outfitters, private landowners, and the state. And these two cases are quite interesting because in the first, there were a lot of people that actually owned land in the area around this national park, and over time they lobbied for a greater share of that revenue. They said it's unfair, we're the stewards of these landscapes, we're providing wildlife, we should get more money, and they did over time. And so by and large, this study found them to be happy to have trophy hunting on their land, and the fact that poaching actually declined and stayed low over time. In contrast, in this community wildlife area, people didn't own the land, and that original revenue generating agreement stayed in place. Communities perceived it to be really inequitable, and so even though poaching declined originally, it then increased again, because people said, actually the benefits from trophy hunting are not worth the cost of having this wildlife conflicting with our crop production, etc. So again, this equity and distribution, that also comes down to policy, is really important. And so what we've learned so far from this work is that generally, but not always, the myth that it doesn't contribute to people in nature is dispelled. We do have more positive than negative evidence, but not always. It's not a black and white issue, and I think really what's important here is to learn from when it works and when it doesn't. Policy matters, equity matters, and it's not just about hunted species, which is still the focus of research. It's about how ecosystems are supported. And it's also not just about how much money is made, it's about how it's distributed. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hayley. A very interesting talk. We do have time for a question in the audience. Have we got a mic?
Thanks, Hayley. That's so interesting and brave thing to address. So with, the positive and negative effects of something, it's always a question of compared to what?
Yeah.
So I wondered if any of those studies looked at, compared to whatever they started with, overgrazed lands, to trophy hunting, but then the opportunity loss, there could be other land uses like ecotourism, and so
that's such a good question. I'm so glad you asked it, because this is something I've really been grappling with, and I actually had a slide on what methods they used that I took out, and I think this is a major challenge with this research. So the most common comparison, so I tried to pull out studies that did make some sort of meaningful comparison. So it's easier when it comes to if species are impacted, because typically people either compare an area where hunting takes place to an area where it doesn't, or they compare before and after a ban. That's a really nice one. But on the people side, it's much more tricky. A lot of these studies compared, they say okay, hunting came in and then all of these things happened, but they don't really make a rigorous comparison to, well, what was there before, or what are the alternatives? There are some nice studies. So for example, that first case study from Zimbabwe, they do that. They say, okay, there's cattle farming, there's mixed farming, there's wildlife farming. How do they compare? But there aren't a lot of studies that do that very well. There are quite a few that try to compare trophy hunting and ecotourism. So there's some degree of that, but of course those can't always take place in the same regions anyway. We know that. Trophy hunting is possible on land where ecotourism couldn't happen. So yes, I feel like that is a big takeaway, is that we need to be much more rigorous in our science in terms of what is the counterfactual here? And there's not a lot of studies that really do that very rigorously, particularly on the people impacts. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hayley. If you do have any more questions or want to have a little discussion with Hayley, you can chat to her during tea time. Our next presentation is by Enrico Dominin on the consequences of recreational hunting for biodiversity conservation and livelihoods. Thanks, Enrico.
Good morning, everyone, and really good to see a good number of people in the room. I guess the others are still game driving at this time of the day. But, very much, welcome to this presentation, and I'll be focusing on some work that we did with Hayley and some other colleagues at the Helsinki Lab of Interdisciplinary Conservation Science, and I would like to acknowledge their contribution before I start my presentation. And I strongly recommend that you will be reading this paper because there's not enough time to go through 1,000 plus papers that we analyze. So I think it provides very good background reading for someone who is not knowledgeable about the topic and wants to understand more. And one of the biggest issues that we faced as we started this work with Haley and the others was to actually understand what recreational hunting really was. And the definitions are very blurry, but as you can see from this slide, it can be broadly defined as the pursuit and killing of animals primarily for leisure and enjoyment purposes. So already from this definition, you see why a lot of people are concerned about the practice and are so much against it. And additional motivations include meat and trophy acquisition, which is actually what Haley talked about, trophy hunting, spiritual, social, and cultural motivations, added exercise, etc., etc. So it's really like, a bundle of motivations that are not only linked to taking a trophy, but have got more even spiritual and cultural foundations. It's often regulated with the intention of meeting certain ecological, social, ethical, and sustainability standards, at least in theory, as I'll show you in the presentation. And of course, a lot of people are concerned about a particular subcategory of recreational hunting, which is trophy hunting, and there was a lot of, of course, uproar due to this incident that happened in Zimbabwe, where a very charismatic lion was killed in regulated hunting, but the practice, how it was carried out, was highly controversial. And of course, this is actually where many of the issues related to recreational hunting start, and there are increasing ethical and moral oppositions to the practice, and there's a global movement that is trying to prevent imports of trophies in many countries. We saw that many colleagues, conservation scientists, have to be taking up also the role of advocates for the practice or being against it. I don't want to be taking any stand here. I'm just actually presenting the evidence as we found it. And if you want to be reading a little bit more about, for instance, how trophy hunting contributes to conservation in Africa, I recommend that you would also read this paper that we published in 2016 that provides a broad overview about the pros and cons of trophy hunting in sub-Saharan Africa. But going back to the focus of today's presentation, we looked at literature that we identified by searching for 25 plus keyword strings. We identified over 1,000 papers that were relevant, that were published between 1953 and 2020. As you can see from the trend line, the number of papers focusing on recreational hunting has been increasing steadily over the years, and it looks like, as you can see in panel B, that the proportion of studies on recreational hunting remains stable in global literature on biodiversity and conservation. We also looked at the geography of these studies, and of course, colleagues who would be more from the human and social sciences would look at these with a critical eye, but I will just present the results as we found them. So there were studies for which authors were affiliated from some 90 different countries globally. Many of these authors were affiliated with institutions in the US, Canada, and Spain. When we look at where the studies were carried out, they were carried out in some 150 countries. And still, many of the studies were done in US, Canada, and Spain compared to other places. But you can see that how in this map, when it comes to studies, Africa is showing up more predominantly. So South Africa particularly, there are many studies that are being done in Africa. And the next figure may be a bit overwhelming for you to see, so I will try to take you through it and explain you what it means. So these are the connections between where the authors are affiliated and where the studies are being carried out. And what is interesting to point out in this figure is you can see that on the sides you have the continents. So we have North America in yellow, we have Africa in red, then we have Europe in dark gray, and Oceania in light blue. What we see is that for North America, Europe, and Oceania, it's mostly authors from those countries who are doing research on recreational hunting. When it comes to Africa and Asia, the situation is slightly different. So there are many authors that are affiliated in South African universities that are doing research in South Africa, but there's also, we see influence of other authors who are affiliated in other continents, especially Europe and North America. Right? As I said, I'm not from the social sciences and I won't be making any inference here, but there are some global concerns at the moment about helicopter science and other aspects that could be brought well into consideration when it comes to these aspects. Then, as the number of studies were quite big, we used what is called latent reticulate allocation, which is a natural language processing technique that goes through the content of the abstracts automatically using a machine learning method and then creates connections among the keywords that are in the abstracts. And we identified a number of 7 different topics that you will see here. So topic number 1 refers to the ecological, evolutionary, and population consequences of selective harvesting. And then we have ecological and behavioral consequences of hunting, studies focusing on population dynamics in response to hunting, hunting as a source of and management tool for invasive alien of conflict species. And then there's another topic focusing on health and toxicological dimensions of hunting. And then we go to topics number 6 and number 7, which are more related to human dimensions, which is social dimensions of hunting, including hunter attitudes, identities, and preferences. And then topic number 7 on economic, social, cultural, political, and ethical dimensions of hunting. So what does it mean? That each of these topics groups a number of manuscripts, which are on the right side of this slide. And overall, machine learning techniques were able to kind of like, identify these articles that were roughly focusing on the same topic based on the selection of keywords that were present in the abstracts. And when I show you this figure, it may be more intuitive why these topics may be important. When you actually look at the topics, how they are spread across continents, then you can see that for Africa, topic number 7, which focuses on the social and ethical dimensions of hunting, is fairly dominant compared to the other continents. And I will be, telling you a little bit more about this later. Then when we look at the species which are covered, again, there's a strong bias towards large charismatic mammals, surprise, surprise. There were more studies on mammals than there were on birds. There were the 2 groups that we were interested in. There's only one species among the most studied species that is a bird species, and that's a mallard. But you can see that there are some fairly common species, except for the 2 African large carnivores, lion and leopard, that are considered vulnerable to extinction by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Then, despite the vast amount of literature, with over 1,000 papers that we went through, there were only 35 species that had more than one study in which we could assess the impact of recreational hunting on population abundance. And for many of these species that are common, the impact was not negative. For many species, we had mixed results. It looks and it appears that, especially for large carnivores, hunting seems to be more detrimental than it is for herbivores, for instance. But again, I would like to point that this is also country-specific. And as we often say, it could be also context-specific. In some countries, it doesn't work. In some countries, it works better because of governance and because it's better regulated. Now, because I'm Italian, I will actually try to mock a Sergio Leone spaghetti western, and I'll try to take you through the good, the bad, and the unknown, not the ugly, of recreational hunting. So what is good is that we know that it provides socioeconomic benefits, and that these benefits can be used to help support biodiversity conservation. We also know that recreational hunting is an important tool for controlling overabundant species and for population management, North America and Europe particularly, which is topic number 4. I would like to bring up again a slide that just summarizes the contribution economically of trophy hunting to biodiversity conservation and job creation in sub-Saharan Africa, as Haley has already pointed out. What is bad is that we know that there are species that can be over-harvested and that recreational hunting can create population declines. We know that it can have evolutionary and behavioral consequences whereby animals avoid areas or some particular traits of the species are completely removed from the population, like bighorn size. It can also disturb other species and it can cause environmental pollution. Despite the vast amount of literature, there's still many things that we don't know. So first of all, we only have 2 topics that focus on the social dimensions of recreational hunting. And as we know, conservation is about people and not about species. And I'm sorry if I disappoint someone in here, but that's something that is critical also to be thinking about, how people can be the motivator for conserving species. We didn't find many studies that consider conservation and social implication, and that's why now Haley has been working a little bit more into the rest of the literature. There's a strong focus on charismatic species. We need to understand what's the impact of Cecil the impala rather than Cecil the lion. And we need more research that supports claims that hunting increases the quantity and quality of ecosystem conservation. And of course, we also need to be focusing on grey literature and literature in language other than English, because at the moment this review is biased. And also we need to be understanding what's the real kind of contribution of hunting towards meeting complementarity objectives and meeting global biodiversity objectives. So, last slides of my presentation. We need to be understanding better what's the contribution of hunting towards protecting ecosystems and what's the contribution towards meeting the new global biodiversity framework targets, for instance. We need to be understanding in particular what's the quality of the habitat and how redundant the areas are compared to what we still need to protect. We need to be understanding better how hunting contributes to supporting people and livelihoods, and this is actually what Haley has been working a little bit more on. But particularly we need to understand how individuals in a community benefit from the practice rather than just assuming that by giving money we can contribute towards meeting livelihoods and development objectives. And we also have to be thinking about future scenarios where the practice may not be there as it is today in the big numbers, especially understanding how we may be able to create the same amount of revenue to support conservation amid lower number of hunters as the practice is becoming less popular. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Enrico. It looks like you guys have done a lot of work already. There's time for a question or 2.
I just wanted to ask if you, in your machine learning, if you could sort of look to see who funds these studies and if there's any kind of interaction between funding source and, because I mean it's such a polarized issue, and a lot of the research is actually done by like Safari Club and others. Does that have an impact on the kind of findings you're getting?
We haven't done it for this particular bit of work, but we are looking into it now because it's part of the information that we mine. Of course, we also have in the acknowledgements the funders. So we can create those connections. But for instance, our work, which has, then kind of like channel into this publication and others that Haley and I are working on together, is funded by national research organizations, and so I think that there may be some bias, but at the same time it could also be that we don't find that strong relationship between studies supporting or not. And it's something for this article we've been receiving feedback that it really brings the evidence to the table and doesn't actually take any stand, which actually what we should be doing as scientists. So that's the thing. Yeah, I think there's another question somewhere.
The mic's on the way.
Thank you. Good morning. Very interesting presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned about helicopter research. I think it's also dealing with decolonization of some of our practices. Is there a way to do an analysis of the arguments of people publishing papers, I mean, in the US for the US and in the US for Africa? Because it's really, I mean, it's very, very value-based. I mean, the wildlife in Africa doesn't have the same value or representation for people in the north that their own wildlife. And I don't know if there is a way to try to analyze the arguments in the literature. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting point. Yes, I would say that it would be possible. There is a complexity of maybe having some authors that may be from Africa affiliated with institutions in the global north, so something to be keeping in mind. What we see also as part of other research that we do in the lab using social media data, for instance, when there are people talking about large charismatic species, mainly in the global north. And so we see that we represent a biased view of how things should be done in terms of conservation in Africa. And you can see that those views are pretty much biased towards animal welfare and being concerned about species and less about local people. So what would be interesting to do is to actually ask Africans to be raising their voice and maybe on a campaign to be asking how they would like the future of conservation on the continent to be and how some traditional values and preferences should be brought into the picture. But it's definitely something that shouldn't be actually, in my opinion, of concern for scientists in the global north. It should be an opportunity to restructure and redirect science into a more kind of plural and accepting way.
Thanks so much, Enrico.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, we've got Janetta Salir, who will provide some insights to the non-detriment finding for mammals that are trophy hunted in South Africa. Thanks, Janetta.
Good morning. Thank you, Kathy. I'm Janetta. I apologize for my voice. I drank too much wine last night. But, oh, wait. You may confuse me with Gareth Hempson. Let me just remove this. But all jokes aside, how many of you have got a trophy on your wall? Are you sure, everybody? Because it depends what we define the trophy as. Okay. It's a tangible, something that we record for something that we've achieved and things. And I suspect many of us have got many of these papers outside our offices. And some of us have probably got so many that we get to a point that it becomes like a Pink Floyd adapted song. All in all, it's just another paper on the wall. But of course, we're talking about trophy hunting, animals. And Haley and Enrico has given you a very nice summary of what that is. And certainly with their reflection also, I've captured it into sort of two spaces which makes it difficult for people. The one on the left is what many people will argue, if I do it responsible with respect, I think we often forget about the respect element when we're dealing with animals. It's about sustainability, some of the things that Enrico and Haley has talked about, how can it make contributions and all these other sort of things. Those arguments are sitting out there. Unfortunately, there are also lots of records of really unsustainable practices. That is the other side, the irresponsible exploitation, and probably a lot of the long historic things. When you look at Enrico's map, there are no studies in Central Africa Republic, for example. And we certainly know that there's been some very heavy hunting in that particular areas. But at the heart of some of the things, it doesn't matter how you think about whether it's sustainable or not, it's often these moral concerns that are really at the heart of the debate. I think Hailey highlighted that as well. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on there, but Enrico just touched on it. Whose moral values should really matter? You know? And an example is there, that set of values that you see across the screen there, what was captured for elephants, and it ranges from strong moral values, strong spiritual values, strong use values, benefits, and everything like that. And you can imagine that somebody that is living with an elephant is going to have a very different set of values as somebody that watches elephants mostly on National Geographic, which, by the way, displays Africa as without people. And I think this is a really important element that we have to think about. But I'm going to focus today on the sustainability of the practice, not the ethics of the practice. And we're going to do this for South Africa. Now, let's do a little thought experiment. It's one of the examples that Hailey and them has worked around. So if I want to have a trophy, I usually got to have some exceptional specimen. It's very often something that has managed to go past breeding and is still surviving after even if the animal has done its breeding. And I usually have far more of those if I've got a large population. Well, I'm going to be better off having a large population. I've got a large area, and especially if that area is intact and all the ecosystem functions are working around. That's one of the arguments that people make. The debate, I think all of us will agree that if this happens, the bottom end here has got this secondary consequences for a whole set of other biodiversities. But it's actually the top bit, the sustainability of trophy hunting, that is troublesome for many people, and we've got to think a little bit about. And anybody that's working in policy space will tell you it's about good governance. And when you look at the good governance criteria, it's really about who's making the decisions, who's participating in the decisions, and how are you making some of those things accountable, etc. So, of course, you just saw Enrico's paper that has highlighted these various levels of knowledge that are sitting across the world. And I've actually pulled from one of his complex figures the little bit that has got all the African animals in, which is that one that you see on the right. And you'll see there's lots of green in there. There's a couple of reds, and as Enrico has highlighted, the reds tend to be also some of the carnivores. And then there's also a bit of blues in there. So certainly we have got information needs. And I don't need to repeat that. They were very good recovery of that. But in the absence of that, the CITES, which is the international agreement that is dealing with international trade, provides countries with a tool called non-detrimental findings. Now that's very strange because you can have a negative non-detrimental finding and I can have a positive non-detrimental finding. And when you're a boertjie like me, you struggle to understand that English. Nonetheless, there is a process. Okay. And it generates a graphic like what you see at the bottom there. There's 26 odd questions that you go through and ask, and you assign a score from 1 to 5. And essentially, the more red there are in that little radial diagram, the worse it is. The more likely is that you're going to have a negative non-detrimental finding. In other words, trade is going to be bad. Okay. The trouble is, how do I distinguish where's the threshold in this graphic? Because it can go smaller and bigger, you know, like an amoeba that is moving around across some other fluid or something like that. So we did develop some time ago, actually, for some other species, is it can be collapses into something that can be helpful. So on the bottom, you see the criteria that's in the CITES guidance, which are largely about biological characteristics and about some natural status. So this is sort of a category that characterizes the vulnerability of a species. And on the y-axis are all the criteria that relates to what we're busy doing, dealing with that sort of thing, you know. And you'll notice there's very, very little elements about people benefits in there. It's largely about threats that people are proposing to them and so forth. But nonetheless, if you do this, you end up with a quadrant of what you see on the screen there, with something that is in the top left corner being relatively low risk and something that's the bottom right corner being relatively high risk. And in fact, if I pull a diagonal across there, we've got some sort of measure. If I'm above that diagonal, I'm likely to be in a non-detrimental, in a positive non-detrimental space. In other words, trade is not likely to have an effect. And if I'm at the bottom, it's the other way around. So yes, we wanted to check and see if the action of trophy hunting, not necessarily trophy hunting of species X, is at all a action that is has got some detrimental effects. So there was a rich data set that's available in South Africa. We pulled it out of primarily two data sets, the Professional Hunters Registers of South Africa, as well as the CITES trade database. There are 71 mammal species that actually fall into this. So by definition, with people exporting these, these animals, they were then defined as a trophy. So some or other body part of some sort that people are using to go and have the memento of the success that they've achieved, as we've defined at the beginning. We had two processes. We pulled a bunch of specialists together. We like to bring specialists together. And we asked them, please assess this trophy hunting as an action, as an activity. And they went through the 26 criteria, and it was a lot of fighting and a lot of discussion and, and peacemaking during drink time and all that sort of things. But they then realized that we actually needed to do some things that are species specific. So we actually had, outside that process, we did an assessment for every one of those 71 species, and we did some analysis of those to actually get a bit of a picture. And that's what I'm going to share with you now. So yes, I remind you, there were, one thing we did, we also classified whether the species were actively managed or whether they were not managed. By the way, if you are accidentally shooting an animal, you're also managing it. You're just not doing it in a formal practice way, okay? And that just gives you an idea of what the volume of trophy hunting is. I didn't put all the species up here. The species that is most trophy hunted over the last 10 years, it's not the big charismatic things that we all worry about, It's I think this was a steenbok, and mountain reedbuck, and all those sort of things. In fact, the ones that's usually causing havoc, the sissels that Enrico was referring to, lions and all those things, are not even on this graph because it's so far way down in the volume of those things that are actually being hunted in South Africa. But let's now see what was the outcome of this activity. So there's the standard radial graph that CITES guys want you to do. So on the left is the activity where we have actually averaged the scores of each one of those 26 measures across the 71 odd species, and you get a picture which got a blob of red in the middle. But of course, it would actually matter a great deal on what is influencing that. You can imagine something that I've got 400 animals hunted versus something that I only have one. It's going to have a bigger impact on that thing. So we weighted the scores based on the volume that has happened on the hunting. And that's what happened on the right-hand side. You start seeing a reduction in that red blob. Now, what I'm illustrating to you here is just, we're now onto our quadrant. In other words, anything above that diagonal tend to have no effects. Anything below that will tend to have a negative effect. And those little gray dots are the actual species, and the little black blob is the one that is the spot or the centroid when I have not corrected for the volume of what's been hunted, and the green one is when I have corrected. So when you look at the managed species, they all tend to be more on the top end of this and tend to be more in the space that is above the diagonal, and it's a very little shift in the volume or the effect of volume on that particular, the total effect of trophy hunting. Of course, when I look at the managed species at the bottom, or the unmanaged species at the bottom, they tend to be at the lower end, but because there's one or two that really influences what happens when I correct for that particular volume of trophy hunting, I see a big shift that happens around there. So this is important because the activity, according to this analysis, may say, look guys, trophy hunting overall is actually likely to have a non-detrimental outcome. But it actually matters a great deal about what species are you busy looking at. And when you look at those blue blobs in Enrico's graph, which was the things where we don't have enough information, we often end up with this kind of things. I've just extracted some species out of the list of 71 out here. So the yellow ones are the ones that are really, they tend to be the ones that are below the graph, so below the diagonal, and the ones that are not marked are ones that's above the diagonal, given the current knowledge, but there are knowledge gaps and so forth. So it's a very important element. Now, in summary, the trophy hunting as an activity, I've now pulled everything together. If we unweight it and we put everything together and we put the unweighted score in there, that's a grey one. It sits right in the middle of the thing. You actually can't make any sense. It shifts a great deal when I correct for the volume or how many individuals of a particular species are hunted. But have a look at that little diamond. This is what the specialists actually came up with after they had all their fights and their wines and all that sort of things. It actually came very close to what the hard data were telling us once we corrected for the volume of poaching, for the volume of trophy hunting that is busy happening out there. And I think it is largely because most of these guys would be exposed to the managed animals or be exposed to the 1 or 2 big volumes that are busy happening. So these sort of reflections, have suggested to us that certainly we've evaluated trophy hunting as an activity. We did not evaluate any of these other consequences, like, for example, ecological consequences or benefits to people and all these other sort of things, okay? The methodology is not focused on that. But what is very clear is that managed species have far lower risks than unmanaged species using this approach. So yes, knowing your animals, monitor them well, monitor your populations, and those things are important. The unmanaged ones, of course, have got much higher risk, and a lot of it links to some uncertainty, and you've got to make some guesses about some of those scores and all these other sort of things. And of course, the last key point is that the expectations, which is coming from that little workshop, are actually linked very much to what is happening to the managed species, because that's where the knowledge is and all that sort of things. So we will conclude here that certainly we have a non-determined finding process that can help us evaluate an activity, but we've got to be very careful about how we interpret that across various species. But what is important, this is something that can help us to largely evaluate activities that people are doing that are for personal gain. So I'm hunting something because it gives me pleasure to have some or other a trophy on my wall, like I have pleasure putting my paper on the wall that I've published. But there are secondary outcomes that are actually carrying public good. And it's that uncertainty on what that public good and the secondary outcomes are that will help us to overcome whether we have got true sustainability in trophy hunting or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very interesting talk, Sam. And I'm sure Janetta will be very pleased to know that she left it in very capable hands. All right, we do have time for a question. Okay, 2 questions. I'll take these 2 here. Ladies first.
Thanks, Janetta. I was wondering, what is the general trend of hunting activity globally, but also for South Africa? So in Tanzania, we see that a lot of hunting blocks, almost 50% are being returned to the government because they say it's not, well, they say it's because of livestock intrusion, but also probably because it's becoming a bit more uncool to be a hunter. So do you have any numbers on that?
I don't, but I suspect Enrico and Haley may have a bit of that data on general trends. I do think that there are other, remember, I mean, I heard this morning things about counterfactuals of ecotourism. Any consumptive use is another form of tourism, and there are many of these sort of activities. Like, for example, biltong hunting or meat hunting is a very big thing in certain parts of Southern Africa. And they are probably requiring similar kind of thinking. Because remember, the non-detrimental finding process is actually just about international trade. But trade happens everywhere. It doesn't happen just internationally. But no, I don't. I think maybe Haley and Enrico can enlighten you if they do know that. over a glass of wine or water for Haley's case.
Hi there, Sam. Great talk. So I'm a Canadian, so everything is managed, not necessarily well managed, but everything's managed. So I'm trying to, can you elaborate on what makes a managed and unmanaged? What is an unmanaged species?
Thanks, that's an important question. So many species in South Africa will have some sort of formal reporting system. Like I got to report how many, buffalo or whatever I've got on a property. But there are many species where there are either no formal management plan, no formal monitoring. I'll give you an example, serval. Nobody's busy monitoring serval. There's no specific management plan that is focusing on those sort of things. And that was the criteria of whether something is actively managed or whether, or whether it's not actively managed. It's just accidental that you happen to do something to it that will have, of course, an influence. I hope that answers your question, Mike.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so our first 5-minute talk this morning is by Clarine Skitter on the impact of wildlife economy transformation. Go for it.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity and thank you for being here today. I'm Clarine Skitter. I recently finished my studies at the University of Pretoria and I started my master's with Stellenbosch. Okay. Oh no, I need one. Many of you may be aware of South Africa's political history and the need to transform our society. The wildlife space and biodiversity is not immune to such need. The wildlife economy reflects the use of indigenous species as an economic asset. It has many elements and cascades. A key element is that agencies may not often appreciate these cascades and do not always develop them. South Africa's Wildlife Economy Initiative focuses on inclusiveness and benefits for all South Africans. With South Africa's wildlife economy expected to grow annually by 10%, it embeds in the National Development Plan and 2030 vision. 3 opportunities are key. How the wildlife contributes to the social well-being, how it contributes to the ecological infrastructure that we depend on, and in the process acts as a complementary tool for conservation. Here we focus on reflecting on the Transformation Initiative. As part of reflection, a number of questions comes to mind. Questions that reflect on the process and implementation, and also on the impact of their interventions. We briefly focus on some of these questions. There are perhaps lessons first and foremost about what we put out there. For instance, in window 1 we had a broad-scale invite for the applications for game. We essentially advertised free game. 24.1% of those that had a site inspection was not attainable by us. In window 2, we still had a broad-scale invite, but provided conditions for the applications. 9.2% of those that had a site inspection was not attainable by us. This is also due to disease translocation restrictions. SAMParks received more applications in window 1 compared to that in window 2, and this may relate to more prescriptive instructions for window 2. We evaluated whether the 2 windows allocated number per species that were within the constraints of what SAMParks had available over the 2-year period of which a window would be implemented. We excluded number of any species if they lived in Kruger, Mukala, or Mapungubwe due to disease translocation restrictions. In the first window, allocations were within the numbers available, and in window 2, allocations were not within the numbers available. Here we look at the impacts of the recipients themselves. We used window 1 as a pilot study during 2023 and sent questionnaires to the 9 recipients. The response was disappointing and may reflect on SAMParks having to check compliance with agreements. With the limited data, 3 key points stood out. Species responded variably. 2 farmers had a decline in species. One had a major fire and the other suggested local snaring. 1 farmer reported increased revenue, but COVID had a notable effect. Farmers, however, did report increase in job and staff employment. Note that the costs were provided in 2 cases, but it was not clear as to what these costs were for. The limited information suggests variable outcomes. A full study will now take the lessons and implement proper assessment of the impact of the initiative. Any insights and advice is welcome. There are, however, some key observations made during the interviews. Many applicants had alternative businesses during window 1. This seems to be an important requirement as the wildlife market is volatile. It seems like partnerships can bring the practical know-how from experienced game farm managers in the industry. A third link reflects on the requirements of a critical mass of assets, in this case, the population size of a species. For that, a required property size is needed. The last links to the diversity of products. A diversity of products and supporting services provides adaptive resilience to a volatile industry. There seems to be 3 potential reasons as to why Sandbox is not performing as well as they can. Advertising with requests that do not match with what we have, our obsession with delivering many animals, and our shortcomings on checking a compliance with agreements. It's of crucial importance to address the above matters and establish the process of checking the impact of our interventions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clarine. Does anyone have a question for Clarine? All right, thanks. All right, our next talk is by Annette Hupschler on the regulatory responses to COVID-19 and the impact on the wildlife economy of the 3 Southern African countries. Thanks, Annette.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be back at Savanna Science. It's been a few years. And today, I'm looking at you, Sam. I'm doing some real science. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the regulatory impacts on the wildlife economy in Southern Africa. But we're using a slightly different definition of wildlife economy from the previous speakers. We also include illegal aspects. So everything applies that Haley and others have talked about, but we also look at the shadow side of the wildlife economy, which would include, amongst others, illegal wildlife trade. Here we go. So basically, I'm going to be talking about a just published research paper, but also about ongoing research that I'm conducting with Meredith Gore. She's an American scientist. And we've been collaborating on a project for the last 2 years. And essentially, we're looking at why is it that illegal market actors, so here I'm talking about poachers, traffickers, and others, seem to have bounced back better than the illegal wildlife economy. So we've basically been trying to understand what can we learn from illegal markets for legal markets for the wildlife economy. Okay, I realized I should have worn glasses. So I'm going to talk a little bit more off the cuff. So in terms of the context, we use COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, as an example of a crisis scenario. So this had massive impacts on the flows of goods, people, and just information. Basically, COVID-19 is an exogenous shock to the system, and some people have called it a white swan event, so that's very different from what is often known as a black swan event. So it is kind of predictable, but it has massive impacts on society, on the economy. Most of us in the room here know it had massive impacts even on science. A lot of us couldn't attend Savanna Science events in the past while doing COVID-19. Our framing that we've been using for this project is based on something called the frictions and flow conceptual framework. So this is building on work that I've done previously on criminal markets and illicit flows, basically trying to understand why and how people, objects move, how they move between the bush and the market. What are the hindrances? And this is probably going to look very complex, but in order to understand some of the hindrances, we actually came up with different blockages, but also ways of how objects or wildlife could move faster. I'm going to spare you going through all the different blockages, but just to give you an idea, we have something called a channel, we've got dams, catchments. This beautiful picture gives you more of an idea, and I will come back to this because we use this in one of our instruments to show flows and frictions. Okay, so we do know that COVID-19 had a massive impact on Africa and elsewhere in the world. Most of Africa had five waves of COVID-19, and this impacted obviously the flow of goods quite massively. We also know that there have been different containment measures around the world, and I was actually quite surprised that South Africa wasn't dark green. Dark green would indicate the strictest of containment measures. So you will see on the African continent, actually Zimbabwe was considered to have the strictest containment measures, which is essentially lockdown regulations and quarantine measures and other things. We basically looked at different measures that were implemented in different African countries. And just to give you an idea, I mean, for example, there were essential work permits, there were restrictions on movement, there were roadblocks in some countries. So all of these would have had some impact on the movement and flows. So we chose, for comparative purposes, we chose 3 countries. The first country is Tanzania, and attached to it Zanzibar. And some of you would know that Tanzania was one of the countries that actually had 0 restrictions during COVID-19. In fact, their late President Magufuli, actually thought that COVID-19 was a bit of a fun thing. It didn't exist. He did some testing on papaya of the COVID-19 tests and claimed that papayas tested positive for COVID-19, which obviously was all a bit strange. Anyways, during COVID-19, there was a lot of travel to Zanzibar and Tanzania. In fact, there was a massive music festival in Zanzibar where lots of tourists from Europe and other countries came during extreme hectic waves of COVID-19 elsewhere on the African continent. Our next country that we've chosen to use in our study is Zambia, and we consider Zambia to have implemented middle-of-the-road kind of measures. So basically, there were some restrictions on movement, but it was not as hectic as country number 3, which is, of course, South Africa. So a lot of my South African colleagues will remember that we had quite interesting regulations in place. We couldn't buy pie, we couldn't buy flip-flops for a while. There were bans on alcohol, tobacco, all sorts of interesting things. Of course, this also had interesting impacts on the wildlife economy, both legal and illegal. And this we basically trying to understand in terms of what we call a cross-case analysis. So basically, we're looking at the 3 countries as case studies, but we also compare them on different aspects of COVID-19 lockdowns, what happened to the legal wildlife economy, which would include hunting, it would include issues of ecotourism, other aspects of legal trade. And then we're also looking at illegal aspects. So what happened during poaching, what happened during trafficking during COVID-19, and how does that compare to the period before and now in the sort of post-COVID-19 period. a second aspect of our study is something called participatory mapping, and this is sort of the quantitative part of our study. So we're basically trying to map how wildlife moved or didn't move during COVID-19, and we're using this tool of participatory mapping, which is a very democratic tool of data collection. It is a survey-style approach, so you can, for example, use it in local communities, and you will show them maps and explain where places are, and then they will show you what has happened or where they think issues of concern are happening. But you can also use it with experts, so you can talk to law enforcers, to rangers, to other people working in enforcement types and contexts, to explain how they think, for example, rhino horn might have moved during 2020 when COVID-19 was at its height. I just want to briefly give an example. Most of the people that know me know that I've focused a lot on charismatic megafauna in my previous sort of research, so rhinos, elephants, other big animals. But this particular study, what has been quite interesting is like a look at succulent poaching. And quite interestingly, succulent poaching actually increased during COVID-19. There was a massive uptick. So if you, for example, look at this graphic, you can see that poaching really increased in 2020, and by 2021 it was at an all-time high with serious impacts on species protection. So you will see, for example, that some conophytum species are now critically endangered. My interviews with conservationists, botanists have shown that sometimes an entire endemic population, especially in the Northern Cape and Western Cape regions of South Africa, can be swept up. That's the term that botanists use, and basically in one harvesting session. And what is quite interesting for the social scientists and me is that interviews that I did with affected communities led to similar contestation of the laws. Some of you might know the concept of contested illegality that I framed about 10 years ago. This is the same in the plant space, where a lot of people say, well, it should not be a crime to pick plants. And often they will also say, we cannot eat conservation, how are we supposed to survive? Here's a little picture from one of our recent journal articles. Meredith and myself published a journal article that basically gave some overview of our initial findings, provisional findings. And essentially what we argue in this article is that there are many lessons to be learned from the times of COVID, but especially for the legal wildlife economy, because what we found in our research so far is that basically poachers, traffickers were very quick to bounce back. If I were to have shown you a figure on rhino poaching, you would have seen that rhino poaching went right down April, May 2020, so initial COVID wave. But after that, it increased massively again. So basically it shows flexibility, adaptability, and also innovation by people involved in the illegal wildlife economy. We don't have figures yet, we're still busy compiling them on the legal wildlife economy and the broader impact. But the previous speaker actually showed some very interesting graphics already, that there was a massive impact of COVID-19 on the legal wildlife economy, which obviously doesn't take a scientist to really consider. Okay, and I just want to show you about the next step of our research. So basically, this is the mapping that we're doing, and I'm hoping to convince some of you in this room, including especially the Sandparks staff members, to participate in this mapping. So basically, we're wanting to map frictions and flows, so to show what happened, how can we graphically actually show this notion that, there were flows, but there were also stoppages during COVID-19. Yeah, so that's my presentation, to be continued in the near future once the data collection has been completed. Thank you.
You did it well. You did a very good job. Thanks. There's time for one question.
It's always been said that trophy hunters are much more, they're less concerned about crises, and whereas there might be something that causes ecotourism to collapse, trophy hunting might continue. And so in Tanzania, did you see any changes through that period? Did trophy hunting continue as it had done before and after?
Thank you. That is a very, very interesting question. So in Tanzania, actually, we have data so far for Zambia and Tanzania, and the early lockdowns or the early waves, so wave 1 and 2, which is essentially 2020, 2021, there was very limited travel from traditional trophy hunting countries, so from US, Canada, Europe to African countries. But you are quite right, shortly after those, so by mid-2021, you had a lot more trophy hunters coming to African shores again. So we definitely have that data. In terms of just qualitative insights that we have, I interviewed communities near conservation, ecotourism and trophy hunting sites, both in South Africa and in Zambia, and the impact was quite harrowing on both sides, so ecotourism and hunting, where communities just said we were left in the lurch. So in South Africa, we did have a COVID-19 grant that assisted local people with peanuts, really. It was very little money, 350 Rand, which at today's exchange rate doesn't even come to $18 US, which you can't buy much with. But it's more than most African countries provided in terms of support. So it has been very, very harrowing on local people, especially women, on all fronts. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Annette. So that brings to an end our hunting and wildlife economy session. Did you forget something? Thank you. So we'll go straight into our poaching and wildlife crime session. Ashley Dorr will kick off with her presentation on understanding who is victimized by wildlife crime and how restorative justice approaches can support wildlife crime victims. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of the lessons that we are learning through a project seeking to make justice processes more inclusive of victims and more effective in responding to wildlife crimes. This is a project that the Endangered Wildlife Trust is implementing with the WWF KETA program, supported by USAID, as well as one of our implementing partners, NICRO. Sorry, I was told that, there we go. Now, why we need to make criminal justice processes more effective in responding to crime is really based on the current state of criminal justice within South Africa. So that's probably the first caveat, is I am limiting this to South Africa and the South African criminal justice systems. But I think the lessons that we're learning can certainly be applied in other jurisdictions, and we have learned from other jurisdictions, particularly Canada and their application of restorative justice. In 2020, Justice Cameron, who's a former justice of the Constitutional Court, published a paper called The Crisis of the Criminal Justice System. And some of the findings are up on the screen, particularly that South Africa's got one of the highest rates of incarceration, of imprisonment. I think that would surprise many South Africans. But very importantly, we also have one of the highest rates of recidivism, which means reoffending, and it sits between 60 and 90%, which means out of every 10 people we send to jail, between 6 and 9 will come out and commit the exact same crimes again. And this is the first element that we need to consider when we're talking about making criminal justice more responsive and effective, is for most people, sending somebody to jail is the end of the line. We have achieved justice when we have an imprisonment. It's actually the middle. That person is going to come out and in all likelihood going to reoffend. So what Justice Cameron called for is to consider, and he specifically says it's in our own interest, to consider more restorative and rehabilitative approaches to justice coupled with victim-focused measures and institution building. This is in line with global trends and in our best interests. So what this presentation is seeking to do is show how some justice approaches could achieve this. Now, looking very briefly at the state of wildlife crime and environmental crime more broadly in the country, the second, what we can look at, this is a screen grab taken from the National Environmental Compliance and Enforcement Report. The first two sections is arrest by EMIs, so that's our environmental management inspectors, not the police, so this is limited to one of our enforcement agencies, and the criminal dockets registered. We then move there to the convictions, acquittals, and what the prosecution declines to prosecute. Now, if we follow criminology thinking, specifically the work of Professor Van Zyl-Smit, who said it is not the severity of the punishment, but the certainty of the punishment, we need to look at the number of arrests made with ultimately the convictions that we receive in the country and try and even this out to make justice more certain across the landscape. When we refer to wildlife crimes, we refer to non-syndicated and syndicated offenses. Non-syndicated by their name is any wildlife crime that is not motivated by organized crime. Now, within this area specifically, our project area is from Hoedspruit to about Hazyview and all areas westward through Bushbuck Ridge. When we look at the wildlife crimes that are taking place here, we have local syndicates, so harvesting for commercial meat markets, for example, for traditional medicine markets. We have national syndicates, again, harvesting for traditional markets and plant markets, and then transnational organized crime, which we're familiar with, which looks at the illegal harvesting of rhino and pangolin for trade internationally. The non-syndicated wildlife offenses would be crimes that are more motivated for personal reasons, so personal subsistence harvesting or retaliatory killing in human-wildlife conflict. Now, why this is all important is that when we started this project, and my apologies, the slides are in the wrong way, so I'm just going to bounce between them, is when we started looking at approaches to make criminal justice more inclusive, we used the methodologies provided by an approach to justice called restorative justice. This is one definition of many. It's the one that I favor the most. I think it highlights all the key elements of being flexible, participatory, and problem-solving as we respond to crime. The UN confirms that restorative justice can be complementary or alternative. We've chosen to be complementary, so we're operating within the criminal justice system. But very importantly is that it provides access to justice, particularly for victims of crime and vulnerable and marginalized populations. Thank you. Now, when we started this project, one of the first critiques that we got was, how can you apply restorative justice to wildlife crimes? They're victimless offenses. And it always sat a bit uncomfortably with me that they were regarded as such. So with some of our research partners, like Anetta in the room, we started to try and understand who is victimized by wildlife crimes. And this is really informed by information that we got from project stakeholders within this project area. And what we've been able to do is break the harm categories into 3 different groupings. Harm to people, so this could be juristic and natural persons as well as groups of people like communities. Harm to the environment, so this could be individual species, populations of species, or the broader ecosystems, and then harm to South Africa as a whole. Focusing on harm to people, the first is to loss. This is something that's relatively quantifiable. We can calculate how expensive anti-poaching is. We can calculate the repairs to fences, the costs of veterinary bills. That kind of financial loss is relatively easy to quantify, and it tends to be one of the key focus areas that we have when we talk about wildlife crime. What we can't quantify is the human impact. so the violence that we see within anti-poaching and responding to wildlife crimes. I think there can be no doubt that we are operating within a high conflict area. We see high rates of murder and assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. And what we've also heard from female enforcement officials is threats of sexual violence as well. And that leads us to the second grouping, which is trauma. The reality of working in a conflict space, but also the trauma that comes from not entirely trusting the group that you're going out with, and the impact that corruption has had on the mental well-being of anti-poaching units. Looking at communities next, harm to communities, these are the areas or communities neighboring our project area, so that's on the western boundary of Kruger. This can be direct or indirect. We received information of increases in human-wildlife conflict because of fence incursions and fence impacts. So we had animals migrating out of protected areas, exacerbating human-wildlife conflict in areas. We also received information about recruitment, specifically of the youth, through drug use. So we're seeing direct harm there. But there's also indirect harm, the challenges about living in and around criminal syndicates and the social ills that come with illicit money. So we're seeing increases in drug use, increases in alcohol abuse, illegal gambling, prostitution, all the social ills that come with illegal lifestyles. But then there's also the harm to the fabric of communities, and this is probably going to stay as a core memory for the rest of my life, but it was one of the traditional leaders that came to me and he said, Ashley, you've got no idea how damaging it is to communities where everybody looks at you and thinks you're a poacher. So what wildlife crime is doing to the identity of South Africans. The next category is really what is relevant to yourselves as scientists and an opportunity to be involved in criminal justice processes. What we want to do is create a space for information on population declines, the impact on the environment because of poaching to really come to the fore. And individuals like yourself who are doing research in this area would be welcome in these processes to highlight from a scientific perspective what the ecological impact is. And then finally, harm to South Africa as a whole. There we're looking at tourism impacts both at local and national levels. Harm to our heritage, who are we if we're not a big five country? As well as the spiritual and cultural use of wildlife that is being impacted by wildlife crimes. And then finally, our international reputation, specifically with the increase in organized crime operating in the country. How restorative justice can work practically. What's up on the screen at the top is a very simplified version of the criminal justice system. Restorative justice has really been applied in South Africa at this level, at diversion to divert away from formal prosecution. It's what's created the perception in most people's minds that restorative justice is a soft approach on justice. It's not, it's just really how it's been applied. And then also at reintegration, what we call parole. And this is where South Africa has applied restorative justice. What we want to test is what it would look like at bail proceedings, at what is called post-charge pre-conviction, using plea and sentence agreements, and at post-conviction pre-sentence, at the sentencing phase of the criminal justice system. How it works practically is that it takes place in 4 phases. So people that are familiar with the concept would have heard about victim-offender mediation or victim-offender dialogue. We've used one set term of restorative justice process. And no matter where you are in applying it on this line, it will follow these 4 stages of preparation, where the trained facilitators will map out that harm landscape and identify who has been harmed, and by virtue of being harmed, who is a victim of the crime and should participate in the restorative justice process. Also, at the preparation phase, the offender will go through what is called a psychosocial assessment. It's an important process to make sure that the offender is a good candidate for restorative justice, because this won't apply to all offenders. And it also needs to be a voluntary process. So expectations and kind of procedural elements will be identified and discussed at the preparation phase. The next will be a meeting. This is a facilitated dialogue where the harm of the crime will be focused on, and what an appropriate response to that crime would be. And very importantly, all of the penalties that exist within our criminal frameworks apply to restorative justice, which includes imprisonment, fines, community service, or the referral because it's not a closed list, the referral to a program that would address some of the reasons why the offender committed the crime in the first place, which could be drug use, lack of other opportunities, lack of understanding or awareness, etc. And then to break the back of reoffending, we also have a year of post-agreement monitoring and evaluation. And then again, in trying to keep this relevant to scientists, my own bias or perception is that scientists love data. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we will be tracking our own effectiveness within this project. And we have 3 objectives. The first is to test how speedily we can resolve a crime. If anybody were to go and sit in the Skakuza Magistrates Court, that's just around the corner here, they'll probably be adjudicating on cases that are upwards of 5 years old. We wanted to see if restorative justice could resolve cases faster than that, while ensuring legality and transparency. The second is that any agreements that stem from this process, that third level, specifically acknowledges in response to the harm and results in appropriate outcomes. And then finally, that it is a process that people want to participate in, that they find it beneficial and inclusive and satisfactory. And again, I don't know if anybody has testified in court. It's not a particularly pleasant process, and it's less pleasant when you've sat waiting to testify all day only to be told that your case has been postponed and you have to do it again. So with our partner NICRO to collect data that would allow us to track all the indicators to ultimately achieve those objectives, we are using or integrating into their client management system and tracking data specifically around the case, how it was referred. So we are calling for referrals from the community, from the courts. DCS is the Department of Correctional Services, DSD is the Department of Social Development, section rangers, traditional leaders, or yourselves. If you're aware of wildlife crimes and feel that this is an appropriate process, please do reach out to us. I'll give my contact details at the end. The next category of information is personal information on the offender. Then information on the offense itself, specifically whether it is under provincial or national law or both, and what additional penalties or offenses there may be. More information on the process, specifically who the facilitators would be when it came in, the date of the agreements, etc. And then specifically quality assurance, have we complied with the procedural requirements, and also mapping the victims and information that the victims have specifically provided through this process. And what we're hoping is, through applying restorative justice approaches to appropriate wildlife crimes, we would have created a more inclusive and responsive approach to criminal justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for providing some insights into this process. Is there any questions for Ashley? Okay, no, that's fine. Thanks, Ashley. You can grab her during tea if you want to have a one-on-one discussion with her. All right, sorry guys, there's just been a request from our online people that's listening online. If you do present, please can you speak into the mic, because they're struggling to hear some of the delegates, especially if you're like looking to your presentation at the back. Perhaps just try and speak into the mic, please. Thanks. All right. Next, we have Laura, who will talk to us about the life through the eyes of Kruger's Fence patrollers. Thanks so much, Laura.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura. I'm with WWF South Africa. I work on a project called the KETA program, which looks to address the impacts of wildlife crime on people and wildlife in the greater Kruger area, and it's all funded by USAID. And I want to start off my presentation by telling you a story. Mpo, he's 25 years old. He's with his colleagues, Ntokozani and Lynette, and they are one morning walking the fence line of the Kruger National Park. Do I have the clicker? This is the clicker. Okay, thanks. And they started off at Numbi Gate, and they're probably 1 kilometer in when they see that there's a fence breakage. So part of their jobs as environmental monitors for the Kruger National Park is to check the fence and make sure that the fence is intact, fix it where there might be some damage or broken. They take pictures and take GPS coordinates and load that onto the Seymour app that's on a cell phone. But they also use the Seymour app to capture other types of information. So they also indicate where there might be some illegal dumping happening. Perhaps there is some spurs of an animal outside the fence that they need to report, or they see some human tracks leading into the park and they report that to their rangers working in that area. And when they come to a fence breakage and they look, they take some pictures and they take the data, and Paul hears that there's a sound coming from nearby. There's a bush there, and they turn to look, and that's when he sees that there are some animal spurs leading from this breakage in the fence to just around the corner there by a bush. And that's when he sees a young lion, and they're all like looking at each other, and immediately, the training that he got a few weeks ago on dangerous game awareness kicks in. He immediately knows, okay, stand still, keep quiet, keep calm, start backing away very, very slowly, one step at a time. Until there was enough space, he couldn't see the lion anymore, and they just kept walking. Grabs his phone, calls the section ranger, lets them know that there's an escaped lion. The ranger says they're on their way. Next phone call is to the local Induna from his village, from Koko, just a few meters away, to let them know there's an escaped lion. He needs to let people know. And they wait in the shade, and it's not long before a helicopter comes overhead, and he gets a phone call soon after to let them know the lion's back in the park, it's safe, thank you for the report, and off they go. And they get up, they still have a fence to fix, and they still have 5 kilometers to patrol for the rest of the day. So that's the work that the environmental monitors do in the Kruger National Park. There's 74 environmental monitors. It's all part of the Department of Environment, Forestries and Fisheries Environmental Public Works program. And and their job is literally to check that the fence is always intact. And they report these issues, and they work quite closely with the rangers, but they also work quite closely with their fellow communities also in those sections that they patrol. But often through their work, unfortunately, they come in contact with conflict situations. So not just necessarily with wild animals and damage-causing animals, but also with, they encounter illegal trespassers into the park. And they also sometimes back home, get accused of working for the enemy and, being snitches, since they are employed by the South African government. So we really wanted to understand this type of conflict that they're dealing with so that we can better capacitate them and help them to develop skills to help them deal with these conflict situations better so that they can do their work safely and effectively. So we essentially wanted to understand, three things. We wanted to know what types of conflict they deal with, how often, and are they equipped to deal with these situations? How do they feel about being an EM? And what is the perception that they have of their role? And then what do others, like rangers or their fellow community members, what do they think their role as environmental monitors is all about? So we use the methodology called SenseMaker, and SenseMaker helps you to make sense of complexity. It combines numbers with data analytics and stories and human wisdom. So give me a minute to explain. So imagine that you are in an art gallery. There are many pieces of art, but you are sitting in front of this piece of artwork. And that's the thing about art, right? Like the interpretation, or traditionally at least, the interpretation of a piece of art really lies with the viewer. So each one of you will have a different interpretation of this picture, of this artwork. You'll look at it, and you look at the different elements and the colors. You might think of another piece of artwork that you've seen before that looks similar, or there might be some life experiences that you've had that you connect with this piece of artwork. But we will have many different interpretations of this artwork. So imagine this artist comes and sits next to you, and he or she tells you the motivations behind creating this artwork and what this means to them and what feelings they had when they conceptualized this piece. And wouldn't you think that that would give you so much more of a deeper appreciation for this artwork? And wouldn't it give you a deeper appreciation for all the pieces of artwork in that entire gallery if every artist came to sit with you and explain, their thinking and the story behind that piece of artwork. And that's essentially what SenseMaker does. We developed this framework and we use pictures. It goes onto an app and we meet with people and we ask them to select a picture and tell us a story about that picture and tell us why they selected that picture. And then we ask them a whole bunch of other questions based on that story to give us some more information and detail behind that picture. So that's a very, very brief explanation of how SenseMaker works. I'm definitely not the scientist behind it. I'm just the messenger of the results of this piece of work. But yeah, all that information about how SenseMaker works is also available online. So we interviewed 67 environmental monitors. Most of them were men. Most of them were between the ages of 35 and 50, a few of them between 50 and 69, and very few of them under 34. Most of them either have matric or were not able to finish their matric. Very few had some post-school training and a few had university degrees. And most of them, like 55%, have been in EM for more than a year. And then less than half, or 45% of them have been EM for less than a year. So these were the pictures that we showed them. They were supposed to indicate different types of conflict that they might experience through their work, and we based these on some of the stories that they've just told us, in person. And essentially, there were kind of 4 groups that we saw, people have conflict with. It's with animals, with communities, poachers, trespassers, and armed rangers, or the organization and their co-workers. So 60% of the stories that were told were linked to the elephant image. There were a mix of encounters that they experienced with animals, but there was at least no direct contact in their stories. But many of the stories included the training that they've received, and they mentioned the training that they've received. And these stories really showed that these individuals indicated less of a fear in terms of engaging in the conflict situation and managing it, and also the ability to then guide others. So they work in teams, so also to guide others in terms of how to manage a conflict situation. Communication with rangers were really critical when it came to any conflict situations around animals. But there was a question around whether all rangers understood the EM's mandate. So their mandate's really just to monitor and report. And there were a few stories where, rangers would invite the EMs to come with them to track, either the human tracks or the animal spoors. So there's just some questions around that. In terms of communities, the stories that were told really showed this link that the EMs play between communities and the protected areas. But there were some conflict situations with communities, and they did feel it was because of a lack of environmental education around, how to deal with a human-wildlife conflict situation. They felt that sometimes they think their roles as an EM is perhaps misunderstood by the communities, and then there's unrealistic expectations of them. They think, you work for the park, so can't you help sort out my compensation claim, for example. They also feel that they are sometimes unfairly blamed for animal damage caused. Sometimes EMs are confused as rangers. Some of the people see them as snitches, and in some cases, EMs did feel that they fear retribution from their community members, and then they don't always report what they know and what they've observed. Then in terms of poachers, trespassers, and armed strangers, so a third of the stories were about people with guns or with dogs. The EMs felt that it was difficult for them to know or prove the intent behind certain actions that they felt were suspicious. In the majority of these stories, these acts were spotted and reported, but they didn't necessarily directly engage then with this person that they perhaps, for example, saw, illegally trespassing into the park. Often they would experience verbal abuse from such people. And in some cases, they did feel scared to, get on the phone and let a ranger know, because they would be scared that the person could hear them. So they would wait until the person has left, and then they would actually only be able to report that incident to the ranger. And there was one account of an EM saying that he saw people wearing the same uniforms as what the EMs wear. Then in terms of organizations and co-workers, there were no stories of conflict with, their fellow co-worker or with their partner. But they did say that communication and coordination in their work is extremely important for them as a team, as EMs, for them working with the rangers. That was really important for them. And feeling that they have adequate support is absolutely essential for these EMs. And there were some stories of where, I think they get really excited and then they want to be part of, ambushing a person that's entering into the park illegally or catching intruders. So in terms of asking them about how frequent they experience these conflicts, you will see in blue where they encounter people that are illegally trespassing into the park, to hunt or to harvest resources. That happens quite frequently to almost every day. And in pink, in terms of encountering people who wants to access the park for traditional land use, like for religious practices, that happens. For most of them, they never encounter those kind of incidents. In purple, it's just, where they encounter people that are perhaps angry at the government, angry at the park. There's sometimes those kind of conflicts, but again, kind of fairly distributed across. For some EMs, they never encounter these things, and a few EMs indicated that, yes, this happens almost on a daily basis. In green, we've got damage caused by animals. So that's your human-wildlife conflict-related conflicts, which happens quite frequently to almost every day. And then in orange, we've got conflict in terms of how the park implements their law enforcement. So again, that's fairly distributed. Some people said, no, almost never, and a few EMs indicated, yes, that happens quite frequently. So where EMs felt hopeful in their story, it was because they felt supported, they felt proud, they also felt trusted by their community. Those who felt more concerned in their story did feel that they were also unsupported in their work. So many respondents spoke about the training, so that really showed the impact that this training has in them, doing their work confidently and safely. So what's it like being an EM? Most of them were very positive about being an EM. They like their jobs. One of the questions we asked them that I like quite a lot is to give us a metaphor. What is it like, to be an EM? And many of them referred to being, strong like a lion or a crocodile, or being, a leader, a soldier, or being brave. And it did seem that from the responses that we got, that they really understood, what was required from them in their jobs. So in terms of where they felt their responsibility lies, is it towards communities, animals, or the park? You could see that there was quite a strong feeling that they're responsible for their communities, and they would say, like, I'm the eye of the community, I save the community. Where people indicated for the park, they would say, I'm the keeper of the garden of God, or I'm the eyes of the park. And where it's animals, people would say, I take care of nature, I'm the helper of animals. But in some cases, you see some of the answers distributed between those different responsibilities. And then just an example between the park and communities. The person said it's like being the king of the jungle because you are the community and the park. So they did feel that certain things were really important for them, and it is around protecting the park, limiting damage from wild animals, defending against poachers, and ensuring good relationships between the park and the communities was all nice things for us. But they also said it's really important for them to earn an income. They do receive a small stipend, but they also felt really proud about wearing their uniform. Then just some recommendations from this research. We do need to provide some, I think, information to the communities and the rangers just to make sure that people really do understand the mandate of these environmental monitors. And then just to clarify the handover and cooperation process between the EMs and the rangers, so that rangers also know, where does, the buck stop with the EMs. They need, of course, proper equipment to do their work. They also would really like to get, feedback in terms of, I reported these spoors. I'd really like to hear what happened to that. So they said that they would really like to get that kind of information. And then obviously training is really important, but it's really also training around power skills. I like to use power skills instead of soft skills, but really to navigate then these tensions between building relationships, when to take a stand, and how to deal with people that are known to them, that are perpetrators or illegal trespassers into the park. And then EMs are really passionate about their work and they really care about the work that they do. And I think there's really an opportunity here for us to, help building their capacity and make them champions for, for conservation, because they live in these communities and they come from there, and they could really be, key champions for us in getting that message across, but also keeping people and keeping the wildlife safe around the Kruger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara, for showcasing the work that the Fence Patrollers does, and also for highlighting some of the opportunities that we could use to improve the program. Unfortunately, we need to move on to the next talk, which is our last presentation, but it is a 5-minute talk by Nduvu Shivambu. I'm not sure if he is around. Okay. So she will be talking about the trade of South African vertebrate species not listed on CITES as pets and wildlife products. Thanks, Nduvu.
Thank you. So my name is Nduvu Shivambu. So I'll be talking about the trade of South African native species that are not listed on CITES. So wildlife trade is a profitable multi-billion-dollar industry. So this trade includes the trade of live and dead animals as pets and wildlife products. So this trade has widespread implications, including overexploitation, spread of invasive species, and zoonotic diseases. So the African continent faces challenges like extensive poaching and illegal wildlife trade. For example, South Africa ranks amongst the top 5 countries with the highest number of illegal wildlife trade. And some of the South African species are not listed on CITES, and therefore this creates a loophole for illegal wildlife trade. So our aim of this study was to identify native species that are traded as pets and wildlife products. We also wanted to identify countries involved in importing these species, and lastly assess their IUCN statuses. So we collected our data on LEMIS database and also online trade, checking online pet shops. We also did a literature review where we looked at these 4 scientific databases, and we selected our papers in our statistical software using MetaGear and Rev tools. So from the LEMIS database, we found 126 species, of which 49 were pets and 77 were wildlife products. And then from online trade, we found 39 species from 16 websites. And from the literature review, we found 263 species, of which 64 were pets and 199 were traded as wildlife products. So most of our South African species are not listed on CITES. and we were surprised to find that none of the amphibians are listed. However, most of the mammal species are not listed on CITES. So most of the species are traded for wildlife products than as pets. And reptiles and amphibians are preferred for the exotic pet trade, while mammals and birds are preferred for the wildlife products. So we found that 16 countries are involved in importing South African species as pets, while 20 countries are involved in importing South African species as wildlife products. So for pet trade, USA, Japan, Czech Republic, and UK, they are our best customers, and the most traded species include common rain frog and puff adder. For wildlife products, most of our species are traded locally, but USA is the #1 importer, and the blacksmith, lapwing, and common warthog are the most traded species. So most of the species are list concern, but we are more worried about the species which are endemic because they have restricted distribution. So this includes 15 species from pet trade and 17 species from wildlife, which are traded for wildlife products. And then one of the species traded for pet trade, which is the western leopard toad, is endangered. And 2 species of moles are critical endangered and endangered. So, in summary, not listing amphibians in South Africa, in CITES, is concerning because these species also face challenges like habitat destruction, pollution, and also emerging infectious diseases. So we need solutions to curb the illicit trade in non-CITES species. So because multiple countries are involved in the trade of South African species, they also bear the responsibility to ensure a sustainable trade, including implementing regulatory measures to prevent the illegal wildlife trade. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ndivu. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for your talk. If you do have questions for Ndivu, please chat to her during tea time. I would like to draw your attention to a poster by Teniko Shivambu on caged birds gone wild. So if you haven't spoken to her yet, maybe just have a look at the poster outside. All right, firstly, a round of applause to all the speakers from both this morning's sessions, please. Thank you. And then there's just 2 requests, maybe 3. We must please remember the photo session with all the delegates from other African countries. We're going to get together in the foyer and then decide where we're going to actually do the photo. Then all